Okay, we've now reached part 7, the final part, in William Walker Atkinson's The Arcane Teaching. Part 7 is called Arcane Secrets. The 3 lessons in part 7 are the secret of the opposites, lesson 20, the secret of rhythm, and lesson 21, the last lesson in the Arcane Teaching, the secret of balance. Following this last part 7, I will then begin to narrate and post on YouTube the arcane formulas, which is kind of the how to this book, the Arcane Teaching. The Arcane Teaching is the what, the arcane formulas is the how. Part 7, Arcane Secrets. Lesson 19, the secret of the opposites. Let us now consider the law of opposites, or polarity, the mastering of which constitute one of the arcane secrets. Listen to the aphorism. We're at aphorism 21 now. Everything in the cosmos has its opposite. Every quality, every attribute, every condition has its opposite. Everything and every quality, attribute, or condition is one of a pair of opposites, and yet contains within itself a pair of opposites. Polarity is inherent in everything. Everything has its two poles, and also is itself one pole of something else. The pairs of opposites, the two opposing poles, are but phases of the same thing. In the union of the two poles, or pair of opposites, there is to be found the thing in itself of a thing. There is always a reconciliation and agreement possible between opposites, always a possible synthesis of opposing thesis and antithesis. Everything is and is not at the same time in its qualities, attributes, and conditions, and the reconciliation, agreement, and synthesis reveals a new is. And yet the reconciliation, agreement, or synthesis, the new is but one pole, or one of a pair of opposites of a new and higher polarity or pair. And so on to infinity. In this aphorism is contained the secret of the understanding of all things in the cosmos. This aphorism states a fundamental truth of the arcane teaching. The truth as everything, that everything is but one pole of a pair of opposites. And that while everything has its opposite, still the two opposites together form the real thing. Every truth is but a half-truth. Everything is a paradox. There is the other side to everything. There are the two extremes to everything. In this great cosmic law is found the fact that diametrically opposed things, physical, mental, and spiritual, are in reality but the different poles of the same thing. In this law is found the explanation of all physical phenomena, the mental activities and states, the secret of sex generation and regeneration, and many other important facts and laws of cosmic activity. At this point, I want to interject. The idea that for everything, there are two poles, a thesis, antithesis, and at the joining of the two, we have a synthesis, a new thing. This fact, and many of the other principles that have been discussed so far in this book, are known and abused in this world by the people who run the world, and but not just by them, but by other people as well. But I'm referring to, if you listened to my introduction to this series, to my narrations, my 21 videos that are narrations of the Arcane teaching. If you looked at the introduction, my statement, I said that one of the reasons why, the main reason why I'm narrating these lessons, is because we have in the world today, we as a human race stand at the brink of either being able to move forward with some knowledge of how all of this stuff works, these principles and laws behind all manifestation in this plane and other planes, that people who are running this world, who don't have anything good in mind for the human race, and who many of us call very evil, they know how this stuff works. And they use it for their power, for their enslavement of the human race, and to control our minds, our thoughts, not just at the physical level of propaganda, controlling the media, education, governments, wars. They are organized. They are patient. They have money. And they plan far ahead in advance the events of this world to keep us in low states of vibration, low states of mental activity, low states of physical activity, and almost no true spiritual growth for their own purposes. They understand how that they are doing this not only at the physical level through control of money and so forth, but also at the energetic level and the astral level. They know this stuff much, much better than most of the rest of us do. It is knowing how this works that we can see how they are operating and how we can take control of our own lives. We can't go take up arms against them. They prevent that. They have the arms. We can't become like them to fight back. That's just becoming like them. They are much more organized than we are. And they do not mean us good. Right now it looks like they have the advantage. The only way for us to evolve past their influence is to understand how influence happens and how they regulate and control. They use these principles that have been discussed throughout this book. They use them, they abuse them, and eventually they will come to their own annihilation, as described in earlier lessons of this book. But here, now, and for the rest of the human race, for the rest of history, our children and grandchildren, they need to live here. We need to become aware of how this all works. And like I said in my introduction, a good while back in my life, I sought to get down to the basic laws of operation of reality, of manifestation. What makes any of this stuff possible at any level. The basic laws and principles of operation behind all phenomena. And like I said, I think that the Arcane teaching lays the stuff out rather well. And here, right here, talking about thesis, antithesis, and new synthesis. The German philosopher Hegel pointed this stuff out. And he said that he who can control in mass, in the masses, in the face of the masses, thesis, antithesis, and the coming together of the two poles into a single thing, of a higher nature, the synthesis of the two, can control history when it's done in mass. The powers that be, like the 13 Illuminati families and and in the several layers just down from them in the social pyramid, use this stuff. They use this stuff. They create a problem. They lie to us about how it came about. Then they offer the solution to the problem when we cry out, there must be a solution, help us do something. And then they guide the solution to a synthesis, a new outcome, the synthesis that they engineered. And we fall for it, constantly fall for it. We believe the lies about the original problem. We want something to come along and oppose it, the antithesis. They create that. They offer the solution. We go, yeah, we need something done. The two combine, they come together, they cancel each other out in a sense. The new synthesis, it's what they wanted. And then that becomes a new thesis, and then there's a new problem. They created that, right? They make it present a problem, create a new antithesis. We need something done. We need something done, something to oppose this. A new antithesis, and boom, a new synthesis. All guided and engineered. They know how this stuff works. We need to learn how this stuff works. And we need to start, well, not start, but we need to grow. Increase our knowledge of how to use these things, all of these principles, not just the what they are, but we need to understand what they are and see how these things are working in the world. These principles at work in the world being used against the human race by psychopaths, by black magicians, by Satanists, by people who just are very confused, by the Illuminati, by the people who are running the world into the ground, and by people who want to hold us back from evolving and turn us into something not even human anymore, and not in a positive direction. We need to move forward with an understanding of the basic operational principles and laws of all manifestation, operating at all planes of existence for our personal growth. Not for the control of others, but for our personal growth. As it was just stated in a previous lesson, when we operate at higher levels of vibration, when we attune ourselves to higher vibrations of higher planes, those operating in the lower planes cannot affect us. They may still have us going to work for them, still get our money, but in the long process of time, of evolution, their influence will fall away because we're no longer susceptible to it. The results in the physical plane will take time. But the greatest effect they have on us, once we get out of just the narrow, limited view of our five senses, when we raise our vibration, when we start operating at higher levels mentally than they do, their effect starts to get cut off and continues to get cut off on us and our evolution. We evolve, they don't. That's the result. And their influence becomes less and less. That's what we're after. That's why I'm reading these lessons to you. And I've just stopped here to interject this point, because all through here I've been wanting to stop and say, here's an example of the reason why I'm reading this to you. Here, 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 here. Well, I finally stopped and said it because it's been all throughout. Places, examples have popped up all through. But when this just said thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, I had to stop. Because that's just such a glaring example. And now back to the arcane teaching. When one has had his attention directed to the existence of the law of opposites, he will see evidences of its presence in operation on all sides. He will see evidence of its presence and operations in all phenomena of the cosmos. He will soon see that no matter what may be the quality of a thing, another quality diametrically opposed to the first one will always be found. Sometimes it's difficult to discover the opposing quality, but the law is invariable and constant, and a careful search will always reveal the opposite. The principle may be called to your mind by reference to a few familiar instances, such as you will always find an up and a down, a high and a low, a right and a left, a hard and a soft, a heavy and a light, an abstract and a concrete, a long and a short, a broad and a narrow, a hot and a cold, a sharp and a dull, an easy and a difficult, a north and a south, an east and a west, a positive and a negative, a male and a female, a large and a small, a good and a bad, a light and a dark, a day and a night, a love and a hate, a courage and a fear, a truth and an untruth, and so on, until you will find that the moment you notice a quality of a thing, the same moment you will recognize an opposite quality. Your first impression after noticing these pairs of opposites is that they are composed of things entirely different from each other, entirely apart and far from being the same thing. But examine a little closer. What do you see? Where do you draw the line between up and down? You may say that one thing is up and another down, in comparison with each other, or in relation to some other thing. But in the abstract, apart from comparison and relativity, where is your dividing line which causes one direction in space to be up and another to be down? You will find that there is no such absolute division, and that your up and down are but relative and comparative terms, depending upon some imaginary or temporary dividing line. Astronomers recognize this fact, and one of the first things they teach their students is there is no up or down in space. The same is, of course, true with high and low, right and left, etc. Also with the cardinal points, which consist of pairs of opposites. Travel north as far as you can go, and reaching the North Pole, you'll find yourself in a position in which whatever direction you travel, your next step will be south. Travel east as far as you can go, and you will find yourself returning to your starting point from the west. For there is no east or west pole. West is west to us and east to others. China and India are in the Great East, but they are west to America. We can reach them by traveling either east or west. You think that hard and soft are two entirely different things? Well, then tell us where you draw the line between hard and soft. What constitutes a thing hard or soft except relativity and comparison? Where is your absolute hard or absolute soft? Hard and soft are but names for degrees of a something, the two opposites or poles of which we call hard and soft respectively. Same is true of heavy and light. Where's your dividing line? The terms are but relative degrees of weight, are they not? Poles of the same thing? What is the difference between long and short, broad and narrow, sharp and dull? These contrasting qualities are but degrees in the same thing. What is the difference between large and small? What particular size makes one thing large and another small? Where is your standard? What is the difference between an easy thing and a difficult one? Is there a positive standard? Are they not merely degrees of the same thing? And relative to the strength of power employed? Perhaps this point can be brought out more clearly by a consideration of hot and cold. At first thought, no two things seem further removed from one another than these two. They seem to have nothing in common. But let's see. We find that science assumes the existence of a certain something called temperature. The word is derived from a Latin word meaning measure, proportion, degree. Science uses it to indicate the intensity of radiant heat. And heat is held to be simply a state of or condition of matter resulting from vibration. Temperature, then, is merely a term used to indicate varying degrees of vibration of a certain kind. Therefore, we see that hot and cold have no real existence as things in themselves, but merely are degrees in the scale of heat. The latter being but a term indicating certain kinds of vibration. Therefore, hot and cold are but degrees of the same thing in the end, and that same thing is but a quality of something else, a quality of motion, having its own opposite on a higher scale. Moreover, even on the lower plane, hot and cold are seen to be but relative and comparative. At what point on the thermometer would you draw a line dividing hot from cold? Everything is a little hotter than something else, and a little colder than a third thing. So far as the sensation of hot and cold is concerned, it is quite relative and comparative. Come from a cold hallway into a warmer room, and you will feel quite warm, even though those in the room might be shivering. Dip one hand into ice water and the other into boiling water at the same time, and then plunge both hands into a basin of lukewarm water at the same moment. What's the result? To one hand, the water seems quite warm, while to the other it seems quite cool. And yet the temperature of the water is fixed. Where's your hot and cold then? You say that today is warm, meaning that it's warmer than it has been. A month from now, you may call the same temperature cool. In the end, you will find that hot and cold are but names designating degrees of heat vibration. You know very well what you mean by each term. You recognize them as opposites. And yet you are unable to fix a dividing line between them or to separate things into two distinct classes of hot and cold respectively. You find that they blend into each other and that the shades of differences between close degrees are almost indistinguishable in sensation. You see that they are but a pair of opposites, and together form two poles of the same thing, heat. The very cold thing is as much a degree of heat as is the very hot thing. The distinction is merely one of degree. The same law is operative in the field of good and bad. We do not refer to right and wrong here in the moral or religious sense, although even that comes under the law, and is a matter of degrees upon a standard erected by some particular school, religion, or custom. The standard varying greatly among the schools, sects, or localities. It is often very difficult to determine between right and wrong in any particular standard or scale. So closely do the degrees shade into each other. But what we refer to good in the sense of desirable, conducive to satisfaction and happiness, and to bad in the sense of undesirable, conducive to dissatisfaction and unhappiness. All right. We find, upon analysis and examination, that these two terms are but another pair of opposites, which represents degrees of a something which we may call satisfaction or happiness. A good thing is one which causes happiness and satisfaction. A bad thing, one which produces unhappiness and dissatisfaction. We readily distinguish between these two results in general, but when it comes to drawing a fixed line between them on the scale, we find it impossible. Some things are better than others, some things are worse than others, but these degrees are comparative and relative. A dirty crust of dry bread tastes very good to a starving man, while the same thing would be very bad to the taste of a well-fed person. And so it is with everything good and bad, all relative. Moreover, the same thing may be both good and bad at the same time. That is, good for some purposes and bad for others. So we must always inquire, good for what? Bad for what? And likewise, the same thing may be both good and bad at the same time for the same purpose for two different people. It's an ill wind that blows nobody any good, says the proverb. One man's good is another man's bad, says another. One man's loss is another man's gain, says a third. One man's meat is another man's poison, says a fourth. And so on, each illustrating the truth of the general statement, a good day's fishing may be a bad day's work for the fish. Good, says one man when wheat advances on the Board of Trade, and yet that advance may mean the greatest bad for another. A writer on natural history once pointed to the long legs and long beak of the crane, so well adapted to catching fish, as a mark of the goodness of Providence. The fish probably thought it an exceedingly bad provision. Well, let us begin with the positive pole of love-hate, which we call love. We find here a high degree of the emotional quality which consists of the states of affection, regard, attraction, affinity, etc. Then on the extreme opposite of the scale, the negative pole, we find the quality which we call hate, which consists of aversion, dislike, repulsion, etc. These two emotional states seem as different as any two things can be, don't they? It seems almost impossible to conceive that they are but the opposite poles of what we might call regard, or attraction, or affinity. And yet such is their real relation. Returning once more to the pole of love, let us descend the scale. Moving down a little on the scale, we find states of less regard or less attraction. Then still further down, we find states in which the regard or attraction is very greatly reduced. Finally, we come to a point in which there appears to be no regard or attraction, and still no repulsion or dislike. This is the neutral point of balance, which is always to be found somewhere in the consideration of every pair of opposites, and yet which is not a fixed or absolute point, but which varies according to circumstances, persons, and various influences. Then passing down the scale, we find manifested a slight repulsion or dislike. This increases as we move down the scale. Finally, we notice degrees of intense dislike and repulsion, until finally we find the negative pole of hate. And you understand this readily. You've noticed the different degrees of love and hate, and have also noticed how these degrees rise and fall according to circumstances and conditions. But have you ever noticed that extreme love often is suddenly transmuted into extreme hate, and vice versa? Under extreme emotion or exciting cause? Who has not seen instances where a woman's intense love has been transformed into burning hate by the influence of some new cause? In some cases, the emotion moves rapidly back and forward, to and fro between these two poles until the person doesn't know whether she loves or hates. As in one of Kipling's poems, a woman says, "I hate you, grinning there. Oh, God, I love you so." It will be seen that all these transmutations of emotional states from one pole to the other, from love to hate, from fear to courage, are but changes of polarity, or a shifting of position on the emotional scale. But these changes are always along the scale of the emotion which has the two poles, and not from one emotion to another. Emotions of different scales cannot be transmuted one to another. They must belong to the same scale. Water may be transformed into steam, and wood into smoke, but water cannot be transformed into smoke, nor wood into steam. And so it is with the emotional states. The transmutation must be along the degrees of, or between the poles of, the same scale. And so, now we arrive at the point of the arcane teaching in which is made plain the process of mental transmutation in its phase of change of polarity. This forms an important part of the arcane process of mental transmutation. By the application of the trained will It is possible for the student to transmute one emotional state to its opposite by changing the polarity. Thus, one may change his love into hate, or his hate into love, simply by concentrating the attention and will upon the opposite pole of the state or quality. In the arcane processes, the student is never told to fight or kill out an undesirable emotional quality by opposing sheer will to it. This is a waste of energy and is moreover quite unscientific. The proper method is to concentrate on the opposite pole and thus change the vibrations and shift the emotional center of balance. In the same way, and under the same law, the emotional states of others may be influenced by polarizing their minds on the opposite pole of the scale of the emotion in question. Hate is not to be combated by hate. This only adds fuel to the fire. The proper way is to form the mental image of like and attraction in your mind and then concentrate its effects upon the other person. Just as you may change your own emotional state, so you may change his under the proper conditions and by the proper methods. And remember this process does not consist in the sentimental, negative, rabbit-like attitude of mind that many teachers preach to the students. It does not consist in turning the other cheek to be smitten. Far from it, this process is purely volitional and not emotional. It is the bringing into play of the scientific principles of mentalism, not wishy-washy emotional sentimentalism, or the practice of kissing the rod that smites you. The Arcanes are not sentimentalists, nor emotional weaklings. On the contrary, they live in their heads with their balance in the will. But nevertheless, they tell you that the way to combat hate is by its opposite pole. This is a paradox which requires thought to solve. It is the principle taught in the old fable in which the sun and the north wind dispute their power to tear away a man's cloak from him. The harder the north wind blew, the closer the man hugged the cloak around him. But when the sun tried the effect of its heated rays, the man soon dropped the cloak because he found it uncomfortable. Polarizing in an opposite negates the first condition. If you're strong enough to hear the full truth, listen to these words. The advanced occultist regards both love and hate as emotions of the me side of oneself. Therefore, he rises above both and neither loves nor hates in the ordinary meaning of the terms. He maintains a balance in his I, like the man on the tightrope with his balancing pole, first shifting the balance to one side and then to the other as occasion renders advisable. He thinks that the slave to love is as miserable as the slave to hate, and he avoids both extremes. He finds that the synthesized love-hate is in itself but one pole of a something else, and he moves up higher to that something. Instead of being compelled to sail according to the wind of emotion, he plows his way through the sea of life by the power of the steam of will. He knows the opposites, the two poles of everything, to be but phases of a synthesis of opposite qualities. I interject here. Remember from an earlier lesson? The opposite pole of desire is will. That's the end of my interjection. He knows the opposites, the two poles of everything, to be but phases of a synthesis of opposite qualities. He changes them to suit himself and his purposes. He solves the problem of the two ends by tying them together. He is balanced between the two poles. He neutralizes unnecessary qualities and undesirable ones by changing their polarity. He grasps both horns of the dilemma. He embraces the paradox as a whole. He claims all, but allows nothing to claim him. He uses all, but allows nothing to use him. Along this road lies mastery. That's the end of lesson 19. Lesson 20 will be the secret of rhythm. And after that, lesson 21, the final lesson is the law of balance.